Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at a standard deck. So the standard deck for today is Big Red for the Theros season of Standard, and this deck's a lot of fun to play because it's like playing red deck wins, but at the same time it's not traditional red deck wins where they would be playing like 1, 2, and 3 drops and just overwhelming our opponent with this massive aggro strategy where you just try to blow them out as quick as possible. Rather, we are going to be extending our converted mana cost curve where we're playing things like Purphoros, God of the Forge, and Stormbreath Dragon as well. And we're ultimately rewarded for playing bigger things and not overcommitting to the board because we don't get blown out by cards like Anger of the Gods or Supreme Verdict as easily. So we definitely have a better matchup against a variety of different decks just because we're not overcommitting and our creatures aren't far too small for our opponent to be able to play just something bigger and not have to worry about it. So before we get started here, if you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below. I also want to mention that the entire deck list is in the description below as well, so you guys can check that out and use it as a reference because I know some people only care about the deck list. And I also have this entire deck on TappedOut.net, which there is a link in the description as well. So if you guys aren't familiar with anything as you're watching or listening to the video, you can go and you can just scroll over the names of the cards on TappedOut.net on the deck, and you can familiarize yourself with what each card does. So with our deck here, starting out with our creatures, we have Ash Zealot. So Ash Zealot's like one of those cards that Red Deck Wins just loves to play. It's a 2/2 for 2. It has haste, and it's just going to be swinging in on turn 2. But for us, it's either that we can be really aggressive against our opponent, we can start swinging in and dealing damage, or we can hold it back as a 2-power first strike creature that's going to block any X2 or X1 creature that our opponent may have if they're playing aggro. The nicest thing about the Ash Zealot, though, is it's a early start for us to be able to start making our devotion really big, whether it comes down to us being able to have Purphoros be a creature or to deal damage with Fanatic in this deck. So it kind of plays into two different cards in different ways. We have a playset of Frostburn Weird up at the top as well. So Frostburn Weird is kind of like the most unusual card that you would see in this deck because people that have played in previous seasons and people that have played when like Return to Ravnica was out, this card wasn't really as played. It wasn't really popular in competitive Magic, and now it's starting to see a little bit more play because aggro decks are much more predictable. You don't have to worry as much about a lot of different variables towards like aggro and a variety of different creatures. So it's instantly a little bit better, but the fact that aggro is so predictable in the format now, having a 1/4 creature for double red is nice just because it blocks any X1s in the format, and if we want to invest more mana into it, we can make it a 2/3 or a 3/1 or a 3/2 or a 4/1. It just really depends on what we want to do with the Frostburn Weird and how much mana we have that we can invest into it. So if we want to block like Luxodon Smiters, we can commit more mana to it, but we have to be cautious at the same time so our opponent doesn't Selesnya Charm or something like that. But if it comes down to trading with Luxodon Smiter, sometimes it's just kind of a little bit more smart to do something like that. But at the same time, like Frostburn Weird, why it's in here is because it can block just any smaller creatures that aggro can dish out at us. And if we want to pump it and block like 2/2 creatures or something like that, we can also do that as well. We have the playset of Chandra's Phoenix, which is amazing up against like control decks because Chandra's Phoenix has flying and haste, making it a good evasive creature. It's a 2/2 for 3, adds double red to our devotion if it ends up being relevant. And whenever it's in our graveyard, if we deal damage with a instant sorcery or red planeswalker, which we have one Chandra Pyromaster in this deck, and this is the San Diego Comic-Con version of the card. It's a promo, that's why it's all black for you guys that are wondering. Chandra's Phoenix, if we deal damage with any 3 of those sources, instant sorcery planeswalker, we are going to take Chandra's Phoenix off of that trigger and we're going to put it into our hand from our graveyard, giving it a massive amount of recursion. And up against control where they're running things like spot removal or board wipes, having that recursion is awesome just because we get to keep on swinging in, and ultimately it's going to put pressure on our opponent. And how much pressure we put on our opponent just kind of is variable based on what the board situation is and how late into the game it is. We have the playset of Boros Reckoner, and Boros Reckoner is awesome whenever it comes to devotion because it adds devotion towards Purphoros to be a creature, and it also adds more devotion towards Fanatic where it's going to deal like a whole lot more damage as well. But for the triple red that we're going to be paying for him, we get a 3/3 creature that whenever it's dealt damage is going to deal that much damage to target creature or player, and it's going to be able to gain first strike until the end of the turn for 1 red, which makes it relevant up against any like X3 or less creatures that we want to block, but maybe they have like a sizable toughness and we don't want our Boros Reckoner to die. We give them first strike and we can block that creature with no problem, pretty much. So Reckoner is awesome for that, but like the biggest thing is just adding devotion, and Boros Reckoner is just amazing at it. So we have Purphoros as a 3-of, and I love Purphoros in this type of a deck. A 6/5 creature for 4, indestructible, making it great up against like Supreme Verdict. Basically, the way that our opponent is more times going to be able to get rid of Purphoros than none is going to be through Azorius Charm or from far and away using Far to bounce back Purphoros once he's a creature to our hand. Of course, you always run the risk of swinging with Purphoros and getting Azorius Charmed if your opponent has 1 blue, 1 white open. But sometimes you just kind of have to like either think that your opponent's bluffing or think that they're not bluffing, so it just ends up being like decisive on whether you want to run the risk of swinging in with them and getting him charmed or not. But with Purphoros, each time that a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it's going to deal, Purphoros is going to deal 2 damage to each opponent, so with Purphoros, we can redirect that damage if we want to Planeswalkers, which definitely ends up being relevant in some of the matchups, but being able to deal more damage to our opponent with each creature is nice because up against like control, we don't have to necessarily swing in with a Boros Reckoner to be dealing damage with them, and most times our opponent's going to be able to find removal for just like 1 or 2 of our creatures, even if we play them off of Purphoros and they don't have haste. So being able to give a little bit more value to the creatures that we play is definitely nice. We have the 3 Fanatic, which is going to deal damage to each opponent equal to our devotion to red. So again, this can be redirected to Planeswalkers, which can be relevant if it means getting rid of something our opponent has, where we can swing in with all of our creatures. Our opponent thinks like, no big deal, he's just swinging in and trying to get me down, I'm just going to use my Planeswalker next turn. Then we play Fanatic and we deal damage to it equal to the devotion to red that we have, assuming that it's not countered or something like that. Then we can potentially get rid of that Planeswalker, but going and playing something like turn 2 Ash Zealot, turn 2 Frostburn Weird into like maybe a Boros Reckoner or Chandra's Phoenix, maybe taking another turn 4 play before we play the Fanatic of Mogis on turn 5, and then we play the Fanatic at that point and we just deal a huge amount of damage equal to devotion. It's pretty sizable. It's pretty nice to have the Fanatic in there. We have 3 of Stormbreath Dragon. So Stormbreath Dragon is the 4/4 for 5 that we love to have in this deck. It's awesome because it's Thundermaw Hellkite, and it has kind of some benefits to it. So it has the flying and haste, but it has pro-white, which keeps it from being dealt with by things like Detention Sphere at sorcery speed, but also Azorius Charm at instant speed. So we don't have to worry about Azorius Charm being able to bounce back our Stormbreath Dragon to the top of our library. So that's definitely nice. It also has Monstrous, which we almost never play the Monstrous, but if you do, it deals damage to each opponent equal to their hand size, and it has Monstrous 3 as well, which is nice, but again, we really don't see it as much. If it comes down to using the Monstrous, like, yeah, it's definitely a perk to having the card for that. We have a playset of Magma Jet dealing 2 damage to creature or player, and then we get the Scry 2, which is good, seeing what we have. It also plays into Chandra Pyromaster, being able to set up that 0 exile into what we're ultimately going to be playing off of that 0, or potentially playing or exiling if it's like a land or something like that. It just really depends on what we want to do with the Magma Jet. We have 3 Lightning Strike and 3 Mizzium Mortars, so ultimately what it came down to was that I had 6 slots available for that type of removal, but what I ended up doing, rather than having like a 4-2 split with like Lightning Strike or Mizzium Mortars, I just split it between 3 and 3. Mizzium Mortars is better up against like the bigger creature decks, and we have 4 Mizzium Mortars total. We have 1 in the sideboard, 3 in the main board. So it's bigger and better up against things like red-green monsters or Naya mid-range, stuff like that, just because it can get rid of Luxodon Smiters and creatures like that we can't necessarily get rid of with Lightning Strike. But then again, like, Lightning Strike is better up against smaller creatures because it's at instant speed, and it can also deal damage to our player, or to our opponent, to a player as well. Or we can redirect it to a Planeswalker, which I like to reference that a lot. But it's definitely relevant. If you need to do it, you can do it. So it ended up being just a 3-3 split between that. We have the one Chandra Pyromaster, and the Pyromaster is nice because it's going to make our opponent's things unblockable. So with the +1, deals 1 damage to up to 1 creature and to our opponent. So that 1 creature that we deal the damage to is not going to be able to block, which could mean dealing more damage or potentially just blowing out our opponent with the amount of creatures that we have on the board. Our 0 ability on her is going to exile the top card of our library. We can play that card during the turn that we exile it, so we can play things like if we just need to dig a little bit more and we're just drawing lands, using the 0 ability to be able to exile like Stormbreath Dragon off the top and be able to play it just from exile is nice. Of course, you have to remember that you still have to pay mana costs for it, which makes the 0 ability much more like in check. It's not like way broken or anything like that. But the 0 ability is pretty reasonable, being able to like essentially draw 2 each turn, but at the same time like not really draw 2 at the same time. It really just depends. Like whenever it comes into the later game, what you end up doing with Chandra Pyromaster is if you like draw a land or something like that, or you have lands in your hand and you're like at 5 mana, which puts you in the position to play anything in your deck, you're going to go and you're going to use the 0 ability first. If you hit like a land drop off of the top, then you're going to play that land from exile rather than the one out of your hand, keep more things revealed. But if you exile like a Stormbreath Dragon off the top and you have one in your hand, then you're obviously going to rather play the one out of exile than the one in your hand. It's less information that your opponent knows, and it just gives you more things and more resources that you can play off of. So, just one Chandra Pyromaster, really awesome in the deck, really awesome card overall. Very undervalued earlier in the season whenever we got Chandra Pyromaster when M14 came out, but definitely a lot better now, definitely increasing in value. We have 24 mountains in the deck, so 24 mountains, and I didn't want to add like Mutavault because it makes our Boros Reckoner much less consistent, and Mutavault's not really something that we need in this deck. It's not really going along with what we're doing in this deck and trying to overwhelm with Devotion and Board State and big creatures and big things. Mutavault's awesome in red deck wins, but it really doesn't play into our strategy very well. So just traditionally 24 mountains, really simple mana base. You don't have to spend a ton of money on dual lands or anything like that. And for the sideboard that we have in the deck, we have the 1 Mizzium Mortars that complements the 3 in the main board. So up against like bigger creature decks, we can side it in and have the resource of being able to get rid of bigger things like Luxodon Smiter. Also, for those types of decks, we can side in Act of Treason to take their big creatures and use them against them as well. So it can either force our opponent to block with something they don't want to block with and like have one of their creatures trade into another. Or we can just deal damage with it, which is definitely nice for 3 mana. Take one of our opponent's creatures and deal damage with it is always cool. We have 2 Pithing Needle, which the Pithing Needle is for like the control matchup alongside Burning Earth and Hammer of Purphoros. So Pithing Needle is going to be able to lock our opponent out from being able to use things like Aetherling or any pesky Planeswalkers. Planeswalkers are probably the biggest thing with Pithing Needle that we want to go and start naming. Hammer is good up against control because we can start turning our lands into 3/3 creatures. They also have haste as well, which is somewhat relevant whenever it comes to things like we can start swinging in with Fanatic, we can start swinging in with Purphoros or Boros Reckoner as well whenever it comes into Game 2, Game 3. But the Hammer to make 3/3s and just get more creatures on the board post-Wrath is definitely nice. Burning Earth up against any like 3-color decks or maybe even 4-color decks if somebody's bold enough to play them. It just punishes anybody for using a lot of non-basic lands or anything like that. We have 2 Flames of the Firebrand, 2 Electrickery, so those are really the last things to mention because we already mentioned Act of Treasons for big creature decks. These 2 are for aggro, and I split it 2 and 2 because you don't really want to commit 4 slots in your sideboard for either of the cards. Electrickery is awesome because up against like White Weenie and Red deck, it's going to deal with like any and all of the X ones that they have on the board. So we can either cast it for 1 red or we can overload for 2, and we can deal 1 damage to each creature that they control. It's great for any of the X ones that they have in their deck, but if we draw it later, then it's less impressive. So Flames of the Firebrand ends up being better for giving us 2-for-1 or maybe even 3-for-1 advantage if it comes down to using it to get rid of 3 1/1 creatures or X1 creatures. So the Flames of the Firebrand is going to deal 3 damage divided as we choose with 1, 2, or 3 target creatures and or players. But Electrickery is like good for anything that's pretty much just smaller. So it kind of plays into whether we're drawing it like later or earlier or what be the case, but having it a 2-2 split makes it a little bit better because we don't really want to see Flames of the Firebrand all the time, like on turn 2 when we want to be seeing like Electrickery, and we see Flames of the Firebrand when we don't want to see Electrickery whenever it comes like into the later stage where our opponent may have bigger things like 2-2 creatures that we want to get rid of, and maybe we can get like 2-for-1 where we get rid of a 2-2 creature and a X1 creature as well or something like that, to talk about some more narrow scenarios with what's going on. But 1 Mizzium Mortars, 2 Pithing Needle, 2 Hammer, 3 Burning Earth, 2 Flames of the Firebrand, 2 Electrickery, and 3 Act of Treason for the sideboard. So I hope you guys enjoyed this deck tech. Again, I want to mention that the entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering videos. And until next time, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day.